As you talk about diversity, it gets me thinking about our past, and you're the perfect person to hone in on this as an archaeologist. How diverse was our diet through the ages?
It's, as you can imagine, incredibly difficult um, to pinpoint exactly what somebody's diet was over a year and how diverse it was, especially the further back in time we go. So we do have really good resolution, really clear resolution on several things. Like we can find what we call coprolites, which is literally fossilized human poop. And we can find coprolites, and we can literally identify what somebody's last meal was by looking at that, right? Which is great, but that's only a snapshot. That tells you one meal. We can sometimes, like in the case of Uzzi, that we in the Italian in the Alps, that we found the stomach contents, and could not only tell what the last meal was, but because of some of the plants that were in Uzzi's gut, we were able to tell what direction he had come from. You know, what he was traveling in. I mean, it's an amazing. We can tell when meat first entered our diet at 3.4 million years ago. There's a ton of things we can tell, but to be able to say they ate this and this and this and this and this is incredibly difficult. But what the archaeological record suggests is that there was a ton of diversity in our diets. And obviously, people by default had to eat seasonally, especially the further back in time we go and the less sort of long-term preservation was going on. Plus, up until the agricultural revolution, which starts in different parts of the world between 10 and 15,000 years ago, we're convinced that practically all of our ancestors, no matter where they were in the world or when they were in the world, for millions of years were fully nomadic, which meant they were picking up and moving on a regular basis. So people that are picking up and moving on a regular basis, especially well prior to the development of the wheel or beast of burden like a horse or a donkey or anything like this, meant that everything that they had, they carried with them. And you don't accumulate a lot of things. Now we're all sedentary. We have houses, we have storage units, and we just load them and we become hoarders. But that was impossible to do in the deep past. So not only aren't you carrying a lot of things with you, but you're not carrying a lot of food with you as well, which means there's not a lot of, you're not eating, even if though they have have mastered in many cases for a very long period of time something like fermentation, which does bring with it a long-term sort of storage capability. That doesn't mean they're carrying around jugs of sauerkraut across the landscape for months out of the year. So seasonality it was incredibly important. My estimation and the way when I taught college classes on this, the way I used to present it is we think that on a and again, to talk about 3.5 million years worth of time and diets, we're overlooking a massive amount of diversity. So millions of years worth of time, different geographic regions, different access to resources and technologies and ways of doing things. But in general, I estimate that we had hundreds of different plants and dozens of different animals in our diets in a given year. And that, if you think about, even if you are one of the most health conscious people in the world right now, and let's say you're a full omnivore, what can you really say you have in your diet on a regular basis? You probably have three animals, right? You probably have beef, pork, and chicken, and you probably have a dozen vegetables in your diets on a rotating basis. And even though, and just think about it this way, and this way I used to tell my students, how many of you eat salad? You know, I'd say, how many of you eat salads every single day? And a whole bunch of very, very proud students raise their hands. I do. They're great. Go downstairs and look at the salad bar today. How many vegetable options are there? And this is the dining hall at the college. And we had a pretty decent dining hall at Washington College. So go downstairs. They have about 12 different vegetables. And then I said, okay, look next month and look next month. And then look during the spring semester. They are the exact same 12 vegetables every single day. So even if you load your plate with every vegetable option in the dining hall every single day of the year, you're getting the same 12 vegetables. So I do think there was a lot of diversity in our diets in the past. And again, even for us health conscious consumers and eaters today, we're overlooking a lot of that diversity.
I want to highlight what you brought up, and it makes a lot of sense. We're trying to squeeze millions of years into a general answer here, and that's impossible. So we're doing the best we can. And I want to highlight that before bringing up my next question. And you've talked about the diversity piece now of plants and animals. I'm curious, looking at these last poops and such, Do you feel plants were a survival food, or were they sought after to complement the meat, even in a time of abundance when meat was there?
Again, that's so incredibly hard to answer. But I'll tell you what my perspective is on it, and I'm going to give you an example of something very quickly too. My perspective is, first off, we were eating plants for millions of years before the first bite of meat our ancestors ever had their first bite of meat. Period. And we know this. We were eating wild vegetation and wild fruits and a whole bunch of insects for millions of years before we ever had our first bite of meat. And then we're eating plants and meat for about 1.5 million years before we started eating the entirety of the animal, and we started hunting 2 million years ago. And we still, for this entire time, we were eating a massive amount of insects, a massive amount of animals, and plants continued to be in our diet. The only time we see plants essentially absent from our diet is in the Arctic during the majority of the year when there was no access to plants whatsoever. But other than that, there doesn't seem to be any intentional elimination of plants in our diet. The question, however, is why were plants in our diet, and what did we do to make sure that they were there in our diets in the healthiest and most nourishing form possible, right? Because we know that they're there. So here's a couple of great examples. There was a find years ago. They were looking at the dental calculus of Neanderthals. Neanderthals were not our ancestors. They were our contemporaries. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coexisted on Earth for over 200,000 years. And we know for sure now that they actually created offspring together. And there's Neanderthal genes in modern human populations now. But for hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals were living side by side with humans. And they were looking at the dental calculus. In other words, the stuff that when you go to the dentist, they scrape off of those metal tools, that stuff they weren't getting scraped off in the past. So they were looking at that on Neanderthal finds. And they found plants, the remains of plants in this dental calculus in the form of what we call phytoliths, these little plant rocks, in the dental calculus. And these were plants that looked incredibly difficult. There was no way that our digestive tract could break them down and get any sort of nutrition from them whatsoever. So then they were wondering, well, why were they even consuming these plants? Maybe they were using them for medicine. Maybe they were using them for hallucinogenic property. We didn't know, but it definitely wasn't for a nutritional reason, because our digestive tract could not efficiently break these plants down to derive nutrition from them. And then somebody else finally came up with a brilliant idea, and I think this is exactly where it was. These Neanderthals were eating reindeer, and the plants they were finding the remains of on their teeth were actually they were actually reindeer food. There were plants that reindeer can actually digest properly and derive nutrition from. But what the Neanderthals were doing was they were actually eating the chyme, the stomach contents and the small intestinal contents from these reindeer that still had the remains of these plants in them. And to me, that's the best way to get nutrition, and the most efficient way to get nutrition from the outside world into the human body is to allow an animal that is perfectly designed to break it down fully, and then get it before they turn it into muscle and fat and milk and all the other things. So they were eating this, and this is still done by some populations today. They were eating the stomach contents of of these animals, and they saw the remains on the teeth. So when we see plants in the diet in our ancestors, it's a very complex situation we have to try to figure out, right? In interpretation. So in some cases, they're probably eating the stomach contents and the small intestinal contents of animals that have already digested it. In other cases, they might not be consuming these plants for food. They might be, but they might be doing it for other reasons. I believe plants do have a place in our diet in the right way, but if we look at all the resources that we have available to us, the most nutrient dense, bioavailable, safe nutrition comes from animal sources and should be the foundation of our diets. Plants, we should look at plants and consider them in our diets for entertainment and health reasons. I mean, think about it. What do we do with plants? Well, with plants, we make alcohol. This doesn't suggest we should drink alcohol or not, but what do we do with plants? We turn it into alcohol. It's entertainment. Much of it is turned into drugs. That's entertainment. Drugs, I mean like recreational drugs. A lot of it is turned into medicine, and it makes complete sense because the very toxins that we're worried about when we ingest these plants are the same toxins that make cinnamon taste like cinnamon and make cloves taste like cloves, right? So we use these things for medicine. We use them for spices. We use them for all of these different reasons, and we also use them for poison. So poison, medicine, entertainment, and some nutrition. That's the role that plants play in our diet. And to suggest that our ancestors were not consuming them is false, but to suggest that we should have a diet based on plants is a novel thing in the history of humanity. And if you're going to do it, there's a lot of steps you need to take to make sure you're doing it in the healthiest way possible.
Okay. So it sounds like we're clear that they can be useful in a handful of different realms that you just mentioned. But when it comes to our history in trying to de-entangle whether or not plants were being used as nutrition, as calories, other than survival, still unsure then.
Yeah, I mean,
because to me,
go ahead.
Let me just add to that. When we eat plants, we're likely going to produce more feces, which if we're in survival mode and we're pooping all over the plains and different animals are smelling that and tracking us, I could be wrong, but that's what comes to mind. And just the calorie density, the nutrition density, yeah, the toxins that we've started to talk about, we're going to go deeper into. There's so many hang-ups that, from my lay perspective on all this, it would be hard to imagine if somebody has access to meat, they're going to lug around some fermented vegetables other than as a backup.
Again, it's really hard. It's so incredibly hard to say and to interpret, but here's another way to think about it. And again, it's so hard. I don't want to say somebody was doing this, because even if I was right, if I was like, this group 25,000 years ago in this part of the world was doing this, that doesn't mean another group the same time or another group 50,000 years earlier was doing the same thing. I mean, there is a ton of diversity. The other thing I would say real quickly about fermentation before we move on, and I continue this, is fermentation checks a lot of boxes. It solves a lot of problems in our relationship with our natural resources, especially when it comes to plants. Number one, it is an incredible detoxifier. It can help, can't detoxify all toxins in plants. There are other things that can detoxify other problems, but it does do a great job with detoxification of certain things. It does a great job of increasing the bioavailability of nutrients. In other words, our bodies have to work less hard to access the same amount or even more nutrients from that raw material. It helps increase the shelf life. But the other part of this, and this is where a lot of our reconstruction of prehistoric diets and our understanding of traditional diets, I think, is lacking. We have a sense of smell and a sense of taste and ability to see and ability to feel for very important reasons. And we enjoy food when it's nourishing. We enjoy food when it tastes right. We enjoy food when it smells right. And fermentation can help improve flavor. It can help improve the aroma. It can help improve the texture of these foods, which were just as important to our ancestors as they are to us today. So fermentation is a catch-all across the board. But I am hesitant to try to fully make a statement about how plants played a role in our diets in the past, because if I even was right for one group, I'd be wrong for others, and it would be a lie. I just think that we need to think about it much more holistically than we do. But I do need to, and this is coming from somebody who's been on a carnivore diet several times, and I think that it is a fantastic approach for solving certain issues in our diets. Our ancestors were not carnivores. Our ancestors were never carnivores. Our ancestors have been omnivores for the entirety that we've been on this planet, and that they have been on this planet. That plants have been in our diets the entire time, and for whatever role they served, and so have insects. Insects have been in our diets the entire time too, and nobody wants to talk about that, but they've been in the entirety. What I can say is that looking at modern living or extant traditional groups today can help help with some of these interpretations and look at the role that plants play in diet today. Now, the problem is most indigenous or traditional groups today have been pushed through modernization, have been pushed, cities pop up. One reason that if you went to any city in the world, just about any city in the world that has any history in it whatsoever, underneath the current city is an older city. Underneath that city is an older city. Underneath that is a prehistoric occupation. Underneath that is tens of thousands of years of occupation, because that location was amazing. It's where the confluence of two rivers came together, or was rich in something over here, was rich in this natural resource over here. I mean, other than somewhere like Las Vegas, which, they have to pump all the natural resources into Las Vegas, but real genuine cities with history have a ton of history and prehistory underneath it. And what happens is where the best lands, the best hunting lands, the best natural resources for a lot of these traditional and indigenous groups have been taken over by modernization, and they've been pushed to the outskirts. So even though one of the things that I love to do and find a lot of value in is to go into these societies and see how they're eating and how they're cooking and what they're doing with their resources, their resource base now is nowhere near what it was 12,000 years ago, because they've been pushed to the margins. They've been pushed to the land that the farmers and the industry doesn't want. And their ability to hunt and their ability to live the same life that they lived in the past has been hindered. But there's still a ton of valuable information. And the thing I'll say is, when I talk about plants in the diet, it's not like walking through the grocery store or even a farmer's market and grabbing carrots and grabbing broccoli and taking bites of it, because first of all, we're talking about hyper-seasonal, hyper-local plants. We're talking about wild plants, and we're talking about a massive amount of toxins that need to be dealt with efficiently and successfully. And also, even though the nutrition that's in these plants has to become bioavailable for our bodies to even have access to it, and that requires some sort of processing.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
We went to Sardinia. The place in Sardinia we were at was actually the epicenter of the first blue zone ever identified. It was not only in Sardinia, it was actually in the same village. What we experienced there was the exact opposite from a food perspective.